18th Century Slave Societies, Chapter 4 from the 9th edition. The first couple of pages of Chapter 4, it really tells you pretty much what's just common knowledge or common sense, and a lot of it you could have figured out on your own. But in order to do this right, I'll tell you in my own way what it says. And forgive me for being a bit sophomoric. Okay, slaves arrived in the North American English colonies in two ways. They either came directly from Africa or were brought up from the islands after being seasoned. The slave population grew by either immigration of new arrivals or by natural increase, which we now know did not happen very often in the early times of the South American slavery. Now, each colony had slavery. Depending on the geographical location, the weather conditions, and the crops grown, that's going to determine the number of slaves that are needed and how they were used and pretty much how they were treated. Now, some of these newly arrived slaves would come over and they'd already be converted to Muslimism. And depending on where they were sold or living, if you would, they would assimilate the culture and the religion of the region. This would take what they wanted. They would take what they wanted and mix it with what they remembered from the homeland. So we would have Catholics, and we'd have Muslims, and we'd have Protestant religions, all in this mix. Your text uses the word syncretion, which means a blending. And there was a lot of that, especially in the early times. It could be that the slave residing in the north, where there was a smaller population, and the blending would be, much more and can go into the local culture. But in the south, with its larger black population of slaves, and the vast differences between the rural and the urban settlers, I love the way your text author states it, quote, a complex mosaic of social distinctions among blacks themselves, unquote. And that's something we don't always think about, especially the white community. They seem to want to lump all the African Americans in one big group, and they're not any more the same as if they're whites in this country. In addition, of course, you cannot forget to mention the multiracials. There was a blending of the Indian and the English and the Spanish and the French with the African American. So in some areas, there were a lot of what we call Creoles. The text also points out that there were some slaves who fought against enslavement by running away and rebelling or forming what they call maroon communities. And they also point out that the slaves often allied with the Indians, other Indians, or they would fight with the different nations, whoever was in control, French, Spanish, or English, and sometimes they would be granted their freedom for this service, although it was not as common as our authors would like us to believe. Not that they did not fight, but that they rarely got their freedoms, what I meant. After all, these slaves are a valuable commodity, and they're not going to be let go that easily. Then the chapter gets into the nitty-gritty of slavery in the different colonies. Now, for those of you who have never had American history, or you haven't had it recently, let me give you a brief review. There were, of course, 13 colonies. I think I have a map here somewhere. There's a map of the 13 colonies. But they were divided into New England colonies, middle and southern colonies. Now, the New England colonies were New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And of course, you're thinking, where's Maine and Vermont? Well, that didn't happen until after the Revolution. Vermont was claimed by New York and New Hampshire, and Maine was still part of Massachusetts. So you really only have 4 New England colonies. Now, the middle colonies are called the breadbasket, and they truly were, because that's where most of the grains were grown. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Yes, Delaware. We think of it as being southern, but originally it was part of the Pennsylvania colony, and it was originally part of the New York group. And then when they sold part of it to Mr. Penn, Penn eventually bought part of it back from the Duke of York because he wanted to have a port. Delaware didn't become a colony of its own until the 1700s. Then you've got the southern colonies: North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, and Maryland. So we've got 3 areas and the 13 original colonies. And don't forget, we still have those annoying French to the north and the west. We've got those annoying Spanish to the south and the west. But the English have overtaken the Dutch and the Swedish, so the English colonies, English language, English customs, English literature. And here again, this is very, I don't know if you can see right here. This, believe it or not, is the Ohio River. So you see, we're hugging the coastline. Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. This is Delaware, Maryland. And this little piece right here is also Maryland. That little bitty sliver right there is Delaware. And this, of course, is the Chesapeake Bay area. That's what we call the Chesapeake Bay colonies. Then you've got Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. Now, this isn't a state. This is just Long Island. Then you've got Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. This area here is what Vermont and New Hampshire are going to be fighting over. New England, you've got, like I say, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. The middle colonies are New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. The southern colonies are Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. That being said, slavery in New England. After 1713, of course, England had the monopoly of the slave trade, and New England's going to become known instead of so much for her shipping as for the slave trade. And like I said last week, if you scratch deep in those New England old biddies, you're going to find that somebody was involved in the slave trade. In Massachusetts, the slave population was never more than 1% of the total population. Connecticut, the slave population was only about 2 to 3% of the population. But in Rhode Island, the little colony who was settled by a man called Roger Williams and his people who could not get along in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it became a mecca for runaways and slave populations. And the slave population began to grow because the colony began to grow foodstuffs for those Caribbean island people. So they needed more labor than the white people could provide. And the total population grew to about 10% of the total population. But Boston is the largest port in New England. It had the Africans there who were skilled as carpenters and shipwrights and weavers and blacksmiths and printers. And the list the text gives you is rather lengthy. And were all the blacks skilled? Of course not. But a lot were. And the runaways would always run to the south, would make their way there. And of course, you can't forget those who worked as body servants or drivers or waiters. The women worked primarily as house servants, and since they didn't get out of the house that much, they didn't have the opportunities to learn how to read and write and how to become assimilated into the white culture as much as those who worked out did. But that paragraph about Black Election Day, bet you never heard of it. A day set aside for the black community to elect a black king or governor. A day the white population allowed and even encouraged. I mean, you wouldn't want to run away if you're allowed to have consumer goods and you have a holiday and you're treated well. That's one of the reasons it was done. Where in the South, a whip was used to ensure loyalty, not in the Northeast. Now, don't mean to say that there were not slave masters in the Northeast who did not use corporal punishment or the whip, but it really was a rarity. And New England had a smaller slave population total in the 18th century. And what they did have was usually concentrated in the large big towns. Your text mentions that the total black population may have been only 2 or 3%. But there were exceptions, like in Newport, Rhode Island, the ratio was a 20% black. In New London, Connecticut, had a 9% black population. The large cities. Now, in our 7th edition, it doesn't mention, if I can say his name, Onassis, which was Cotton Mather's slave. Now, doesn't he look like a real ring-tailed hoot? Of course, that's not his real hair. It's a wig. It was the way they dressed back in those days. It did mention the event, but not the person responsible. So this edition does give us some new and important information. See, Cotton Mather was a very politically influential and New England Puritan minister. And when his slave told him that there was a procedure that they used in Africa to prevent smallpox, Mather listened. He was very pragmatic. And he even suggested using it during an epidemic in Boston. Of course, the leading citizen called that African solution and wouldn't even consider it, because it required an inoculation of a non-infected person with live smallpox. Now, granted, you would usually have a small case, which was not normally fatal. And once you got over that, you would be immune. And the very kind, religious people of Boston were so grateful that they bombed his house, firebombed his house, because it was being very heretic. So slavery in New England, well, it was much milder and less populated than the southern colonies, but as your text authors point out so aptly, that the religious New Englanders did not let their religious beliefs interfere with their profits from slavery or using an enslaved person for work. Now the middle colonies or mid-Atlantic colonies. Those middle colonies were bustling with trade, and they had many different ethnic and religious groups. So the slave entering this region would encounter not only the English, but they encountered Dutch and Swedish and Germans and French. And the area was great for farming, and so many problems were going on in Europe at this time that, and even William Penn sent out flyers, especially to Germany, to get people to come over. And that's where you get the Pennsylvania Dutch from. So the farming areas drew a lot of foreigners. They knew how to farm. It was truly the breadbasket of the New World. Now, New York, much as today, drew the most, especially those who wanted to stay in an urban setting, maybe have a business or enjoy the mixed cultures. And your text points out that there was a black holiday celebrated in New York and New Jersey called Pinkster, which mixed Dutch and African culture, and in a way this helped build the very distinctive black community and their identity. But in the beginning, there was a lot more freedom for the slave and even opportunities to become free. But the tightening of rules at the beginning of the 18th century led to a lot fewer being manumitted. And I believe the figure given in your text was between 1698 and 1763, only 90 were freed in Philadelphia. So by the middle of the 1800s, the slave population had grown, especially around the Hudson River Valley, because these large farms, well, they were growing grains and vegetables and foodstuff to ship to the West Indies. Now, of course, there were some who worked as house servants, but primarily they worked as field hands. They did all the usual chores. They chopped the wood, they cleared the fields, they pressed the cider, they fertilized the ground. They were used as boatmen and drivers at any job that needed to be done. Now, Pennsylvania, started by William Penn as a refuge for those persecuted for being Quakers. Now, that was a colony. If you had a choice, that was a colony to be in if you were white or black. They didn't require you to be a Quaker, but of course it was encouraged. They treated the Indians fairly. They even paid the Indians for their land. Then they had a society called the Society of Friends, who actually started discussing the justification of slavery. Side note. I don't know how much you know about Daniel Boone, but since most of you are in Kentucky, I want to give you a little brief trip down memory lane, so to speak. Daniel Boone was a third generation Englishman coming in, and they settled in Pennsylvania, and they were Quakers. Well, that's fine. And yet Daniel Boone is a paradox. He has not killed the Indians that he's been credited with killing. He was a lonely man. Well, not lonely. He liked to be alone. A very solitary man. He liked to hunt. He had very little formal schooling. And a large family. And his father was a very strict man. And one of the things he wrote was that Daniel wouldn't bend, so to speak. And if Daniel did something wrong, and he did a lot of things wrong, his dad would spank him with a rod, and Daniel wouldn't cry. And of course, even as a child, I learned that the sooner you cried when you're being punished, the sooner the punishment ends. But Daniel wouldn't cry, he wouldn't bend. But all of a sudden, they were expelled from the Quaker Church. And well, not expelled, that's the wrong word. They were shunned. But it seems that one of Daniel's sisters got married, and she had the audacity to have a child born in 6 months. Now, the church was very much against premarital relations, so they decided to shun them. Well, Daniel and his family decided they didn't want to be shunned, so they left Pennsylvania and went to North Carolina, and therein lies the tale. But notwithstanding, as well as things were in Pennsylvania, the life of a slave was not a bed of roses. They did have poor diets. There really wasn't that good at housing. And of course, by having bad housing and bad food, they were subjected to epidemics of whooping cough and measles and infections of the lungs. But now the Chesapeake and Virginia, the Chesapeake colonies and the southern colonies, Maryland and Virginia were called the Chesapeake colonies because they were located in the Chesapeake Bay. I think I got a map here. There it is. Okay, here we go. This is the Chesapeake Bay I showed you a while ago. You've got Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia all right in here. Actually, you could spend an entire semester discussing slavery and the growth of it in this one area. but we need to move it along. Now, most of the slaves that arrived early on were from one region, in particular in Africa, and spoke the same language, which was not what the slaves and the Creoles and the colonies were speaking at the time. So, being in a strange place with strange languages and customs, they did not make a very peaceful or docile slave. They'd run away in groups of men and women, and of course, they'd be hunted down and returned. Because success was just almost impossible to achieve, and the color of your skin is so dark and they stand out among the whites. And of course, you've got those unusual characteristics. You've got tattoos, and you've got your teeth are filed, and you stand out even when you're with another group of blacks. Now, most of the Virginia planters, of course, preferred the male to the female worker, but it was soon discovered that, the men were more domiciled with the female around, and if you got a female and a male, you could have natural increase, which you didn't have when you just had the men. Yeah, this is a rhetorical question. Of course, I don't expect you to answer, but did your opinion of our third president change when you read what he had to say about black females and their ability to bear children and being worth more than the best men in the field? And he was the one who tried to get anti-slavery language in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. To say he's a paradox is putting it mildly. Very strange. Okay, there's your map again. By 1740, after having reached a 40% population ratio, the number of imported slaves began to drop in Virginia. And as the sex ratio increased and natural increase increased, of course, the importation stopped. So the slave population of Virginia would become a true American-born slave, and they didn't need further importation. And eventually they're going to become known as a trader of slaves instead of using them. Now, Virginia and Maryland are also known as the Upper South. The lower. Yeah, Virginia and Maryland are Upper South colonies. The Lower South was North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Because of the Africans' knowledge of rice growing, they in turn taught the white men how to grow and cultivate the crop. But the sad thing is the rice becomes more important as a cash crop, so did the importation of more and more slaves. And most of them coming directly from Africa didn't take time to go get seasoned in the islands. And as the plantations would grow, so did the black population. It wouldn't be until the 1760s that the black population of South Carolina began to grow by natural increase. Because prior to that time, the death rate was very high in those rice growing fields. You had malaria, you had snakes. It was not good. And of course, the ratio of female to male was also low at that time. But research shows that the slaves in South Carolina seem to be able to retain more of their native culture than those in Virginia or Delaware. Now, this wasn't always good because, the female black slaves took care of the white children. So the young white children would pick up the speech patterns and actions of their caregivers, and sometimes to the detriment of the child. And also because the white slave owners would leave the malaria areas of the rice growing fields during the hot summers, the black workers would be left alone with usually a black gang boss or overseer. And this in turn led to somewhat greater, shall we say, cultural autonomy between the slaves than those in the Upper South. Now, there is a certain area of South Carolina that's called the Low Country even today. The climate and soil is of a, different nature than it is anywhere else in the state. And I can attest to that because that's where I'm living right now, in the Low Country. And the Low Country is right around Charleston. And believe me, it is low. It's wet and damp and, they had drought throughout Carolina this last year like everyone else did, but not here in the Low Country. We had rain and rain and rain. And driving down the streets, you have trees intertwining. It's like going through a jungle almost. And I am still amazed at the distance between the houses and the greenery. Here it is February, and I've got flowers blooming in my flower bed. But this Low Country is where the slaves had less supervision, and they could actually obtain some semblance of a life. They could grow their own gardens and even take the surplus to town and sell it. Now, large groups also lived together on the plantations, and sometimes they even built their own living quarters. But even so, there was the urban slave and the rural slave. In Charleston, for instance, a lot of females worked as cooks and seamstresses, and they'd sell their wares in the marketplace. And at times, what I thought was cute, the way your book put it, they would be a bit, shall we say, disorderly to protest their slave status. And of course, their idea of passing a law so they couldn't wear silks or etc. They didn't want them to appear to be on equal status with the whites. And the irony is they passed similar laws to that in Boston back in the 1600s. You were not allowed to dress or act above your station in life. They wanted you to be so that anyone could look at you and see how you're dressed and tell which class you belong to. But Charleston. Charleston and New Orleans were not the usual slave towns. In Charleston, there was not a law prohibiting interracial relationships. And there were numerous mulatto children to prove this. The novel you're reading, I believe, takes place in Carolina. In South Carolina and Louisiana, we both have documented records of free blacks owning slaves. It's a different world altogether in that area. But the mulattoes were very much overrepresented, really, in the skilled jobs. And they were allowed to join the white churches because they could assimilate. Because sometimes, if you're just a third or a fourth African, you can pass for white. You might even have blue eyes. And one of the practices that the Africans brought with them and kept was the practice of what is called minsi, M-I-N-I-S-I. Basically means sacred medicines. And with that, the person wore a charm or medicine bag around his neck to keep him or her healthy and safe. And I couldn't help but think when I read it about the acidity bags we used to have here in this country and the things my grandmother used to put around my neck when I got sick. Of course, one of her pet things was if you had a cold, she'd take a piece of white wool, hang it in front of the fireplace and get it good and hot, and then smear it with Vicks and slap it on your chest. Woo! Man, that was hot. And these people also had their own brand of medicine man. And they would use herbs and concoctions, and on occasion did heal whites with, not just blacks, but sometimes they healed whites with their concoctions. And of course, there's that story about Caesar, who could cure with herbs and roots, and actually got his freedom and had his cures published. That was really cool. But that is an extreme exception, because most slaves did not get that kind of opportunity. And if they chose to remain a slave or run away or rebel, that's the only choices you had. Stay a slave, run away, rebel. And in this area, a runaway would head south to the Spanish-owned area where they would be welcome. Later in our history, General Andrew Jackson, another one of our presidents, actually got us Florida was ceded to us because there were so many slaves running to the Floridas, and he even went down there and hanged a few people. And very illegal. And he told the Spanish that if they could not control Florida, then he'd come down there and do it for them. And before you know it, they gave it to us. Well, it's a long story, which we'll get into later. And of course, we're not going to go into the Stono Rebellion. But in St. Augustine, if you became a Catholic, you can be granted your freedom. I enjoyed reading that story about Francisco Mendez, and I hope you did. I personally think information about his story would make a very good question, don't you? Now, I usually agree with our text authors, but that bit in there about the War of Jenkins here, I do have somewhat of a problem. Now, your text claims that James Oglethorpe of Georgia started the War of Jenkins here, and I do acknowledge that the Spanish did not recognize Georgia as belonging to the British. I also acknowledge that there were black and Indians patrolling the border between the disputed area and Spanish Florida. I do not believe that Oglethorpe of Georgia started the war. There were battles, and the gist of the account is accurate, but how they tied the battles they were having down there between the British and the Spanish and the colonists, or the British and the colonists, with the Jenkins incident, I do not understand at all. So I want you to go on the web, type in War of Jenkins Ear, a prelude to a larger conflict, and it'll take you to the Military American History site, and it gives you a little bit of a different side of the story of that little war. Because originally, in the American history books, they say that Mr. Jenkins, or Captain Jenkins, was a sea captain captured by the Spanish, and as punishment for trading with the Spanish people, he had his ear cut off. So he gets all the way back to England and shows up in Parliament waving something black in his hand. Nobody was ever sure what it was. He just claimed it was his ear. But read that section. I'm going to ask you a question on it afterwards. Now to the lower Mississippi Valley, which was not one of the original colonies. And of course, the main town there, of course, was New Orleans, first settled by the French, who lost control of it after the French and Indian War in 1763. And the Spanish had control of it till we purchased Louisiana in 1803. Now, this area is full of swamps and bayous and deltas all along the Mississippi River. And slaves who were brought there were, well, they were the rowdiest of the rowdy. But for a while, after 1743, the slave trade actually stopped. But once the Spanish took over, of course, it started again. And the population of this area was a combination of French and Spanish and German and runaway slaves from the colonies and runaway blacks from the islands. And because of this large black population, well, our local historians claim that it has the most Africanized slave culture. And of course, they practice their African religious beliefs with charms and amulets. And the nice thing is they usually kept their African names. Now, rice became a main crop, that along with indigo and later on tobacco. But the French were much easier with their slaves. They actually allowed them to have a small piece of property to grow vegetables. And here, as in Charleston, the slaves would exchange their surplus, and I think your text calls this the frontier exchange economy. But as in other colonies, if the slaves sided with whichever nation was in control, be it French, Spanish, or British, and helped them fight their wars, they would sometimes gain their freedom. And even sometimes they'd ally with a local Indian against another Indian tribe, and sometimes they would pay for that with their lives. Now, some slaves would run away and try to form maroon colonies or communities, and they escaped to the swamps. The Creoles would run in family units, but the young black men would, of course, run individually. And these communities, they do what anyone would do. They build their huts, they grow vegetables, they hunt and they fish. And sometimes they would even work with the local sawmill owners cutting timber in the swamps because the white men didn't want to go out there. There's snakes and alligators. Of course, one of the most famous communities was led by a man named Juan Malo, and the locals called him Saint Malo. But the Spanish wanted to eliminate all the maroon communities, and after several unsuccessful attempts, they did manage to catch more than 100, including Saint Malo, and hanged him and his wife. So they eliminated the maroon community of Gillard Land, which had been located just below New Orleans. It was the most famous one. Culturation. We went through this first chapter, and of course, it took several centuries for these Africans to forge their own identity rather. And they did this even though they were being used as beasts of burden in most of the colonies. We also begin to hear not just justifications of slavery, but we begin to hear what we call apologists, saying that in the South, the slaves were treated as family members. We cared for them when they were sick. We fed them. We clothed them. We housed them. Whereas in the North, if an immigrant got sick, you would let him go from his job. If he got hurt on the job, you'd fire him. We treated our people, the black community, the blacks, our slaves, as family. They were plantation family. But you don't sell family. Our next chapter 5 is Give Me Liberty, and is a very short one. It's only 15 pages. So I'm going to combine chapters 5 and 6. Now, chapter 6 is called Building Communities in the Early Republic. Now, it's 24 pages, but there's pictures and there's charts, so, it's not going to be all that bad. So we're going to cover the Revolution and what happens afterwards to the black community, so be warned. We'll also get into Thomas Jefferson and his problems. We'll get into how the blacks have to fight for the war, and we've got some interesting stories for there. I've also got a couple of pictures I'm going to show you. One drawn by a black man, one drawn by a white man of the Boston Massacre. It's very interesting to compare them. We will do that next time. So this is a very short chapter, a very short lecture, and you're not going to have that much to do. But next week I'm going to get you. I'll get you. So enjoy this one.